Surprise! Who knew that making clothing was so pernickety? Super annoying. Annoying's the wrong word. Just, it's like a claw in the side. It just keeps digging at you. Dig. So, continuing on with this skirt, we're going to get it finished today for reals. So yesterday, we were trying to sort out the weight painting and the clipping. All sorts of minor irritations, shall we say. Irritations. So we had some clipping showing up in some... Oh, I need to start zoom. Zoom it. Right, so now that the stream is going, I shall shut that. Right, so yesterday we were trying to sort out some clipping issues where the torso was clipping through the clothing item. You could just about see something there, the pink bit, that little pink spot. So do we go to the nth degree in trying to get rid of things like that? Or drive new product 80. I wonder if there is a way. Actions. Standing, sitting, blink, wave. Standing, that's the morphs for the face. That's morphs for sitting. So these are the poses. So the standing ones we don't really have an issue with. Sitting ones. So let's... Because I was wondering... what happens if... So we need to... Whoops. So I'm wondering why no one's thought to do this. Oh no, that won't work. What I was going to try and do was, because I suppose what we could do Okay, let's see if this will work. Pick same ensemble, avatar, apply. Right, sit 1, that's fine. Add, sit 2. So what I'm doing here, sit 1. There's barely any difference between those two. That can't be right. Drive a new product, 80. So 1 to 90. Because the problem that we have is making clothing is that we don't have any pose, avatar poses. We don't have a way to get rid of that. Sit 1, sit 2. Seat 3, so that's 1 to 2. Because the problem that the problem with clothing is that, so we've loaded in the clothing item. In this instance, it's a skirt. But in order to check the deformation of the mesh, so checking whether our weight paint values have been set up properly, and that the mesh is distorting in a way that doesn't have the underlying avatar clipping through the mesh, IMVU doesn't provide us with the option to specifically test the clothing item with a particular pose. So it just, there's a bit of clipping. That's what we're trying to get rid of. So when we derive a product, so when we make a product derivation from the originals, so we've got all the top, bottom, shoes, etc., it always loads in the default avatar, and that is always cycling through a set of 8 animations. So when you're trying to sort out a problem with a clothing item, you're having to wait for it to randomly decide which is the appropriate avatar, the appropriate pose. Oh, you're very welcome, Subsins. Yes, so yes, so it's just choosing between whether you. It's some people find videos better than written tutorials, and others find the written tutorials better than the videos. So yeah, thanks for that. That's appreciated. So yes, because we don't have fixed, there isn't an option. We should be able to, in actions, for example, there should be something in here that lists all the poses that the avatar is animating through, or whether they're a static pose, which is what this one is, versus an animated one, which is what sit 1. So we need to replace for that, but we should be able to selectively choose which pose we want to test the clothing item against, so that we can properly determine how the mesh is deforming relative to the character. And it's not just IMVU that does this, they all do this, all of them. And it's kind of frustrating as a content creator, because we don't have the luxury of having access to the original tools or the original files. And because if they were to be handed out to the community, you can bet your bottom dollar that, so that nefarious users would just upload them as their own products, which obviously IMVU in this particular instance want to try and avoid. But the problem with that is that it makes content creating essentially after the fact, which is what content creators are, user-generated content creators. That's people that make stuff for the games. We're doing things after the fact, so we don't have access to the same tools that the original authors had when they were developing the game. And that makes all of this stuff very frustrating. And of course it means it potentially compounds creation issues or optimization issues, because in order to get round problems like this, instead of having access to the original files where creators might be able to address problems more directly, so having access to the original pose or the original animation data might mean being able to see what's causing this problem specifically and address it using the original files. But because we don't have that, creators overcompensate, and they start, as we were talking about yesterday, they start adding more detail to the mesh when it's not necessary, in order to try and compensate for and address problems where, for example, with this clipping. And it makes the whole process kind of frustrating. And it's one of the reasons why a lot of people just give up, because they face these problems, don't have an easy way to sort them out, and just think, stuff it. So what potentially we could do is deriving from, in this particular with IMVU, in this particular instance from IMVU, we can derive from, I don't know if this is actually possible, because so we derive from the original avatars. So it's 80 for female and 191 for male, and they both have the same core fundamental animations that they play through when they are just standing or sitting without any custom poses or anything like that. So if we are able to essentially isolate each of these poses so that they don't play automatically, so it's not automatically cycling through them, if we can trigger them, then it means that if that's created as a mood item, it might mean that you'd be able to derive your product as normal. So if you were making a skirt, as we're doing here, or a shirt, it doesn't really matter, might then be able to load in a pose pack that contains the original poses that the IMVU avatar uses, so we can trigger through them. Sit 3. It's not going to work now, is it? Sit 3. Why is that not doing anything? So we can trigger through them and test the... No, it's not that one. And test the clothing item against the specific poses that IMVU is defaulting to. So there we go. Sit 3, sit 1, sit 2. So you could load this in as a mood file, and it would contain triggers for each of the poses that you could then test your product with. So I don't know if that's possible, but I'm just gonna... How many have we got? 8. So that's 4. But that would make things a heck of a lot easier. So that's 1 to 90. But it's one of those things that that a lot of studios, publishers, whoever they are, whether it's IMVU, CineSpace, Second Life, it doesn't matter. They all do the same thing because they don't think too far forward with respect to their content base, their user base rather, content creators. Because it's one thing to have the tools available, but then another to make sure that looks like pose 3. Pose 2. To make sure that content that is created by third parties is fully compatible with their own systems. And you can't do that if people are trying to, that's 1 to 90 as well, trying to essentially reverse engineer compatibility with the service that they're using. So in this instance it's IMVU. So when you're making clothing, you're trying to reverse engineer the clothing fitting the avatar correctly using tools that you don't have access to or full access to. I mean, we don't even have a wireframe overview that we can see. We don't have a way of activating the skeletal, being able to see the skeleton, whether it's just as a wireframe. So we get all the bones showing up. So we can see what bones are where and what they're doing. Because the way that IMVU animates some of these poses isn't the way that you might expect them to be. And if you didn't know that, again, it causes problems with trying to make sure that content works properly with whatever it is that you're making. Sit 5. Is it me, or do these poses look like they're just repeating themselves? Six. I mean, it's one thing. What's 6? It's 1 to 90. It's one thing where there is no expectation in particular to allow the user base to create custom content. So, for example, modding a game like the early first-person shooters. So the community essentially hacked at the game, created content for it, and although that was not necessarily the developer's intent to do that, the basic tools or access to the core tools used to make the game was possible, so you could make content. Not always fully compatible because, again, you don't have access to the full tool set until after the fact. But with systems like IMVU, Second Life, CineSpace, all of them, where user-generated content is core to the way that the games work, then you can't, pardon the French, half-arse the tools that content creators have access to. And they all kind of do this. They 80 or 90%, and then the last 10% that would really help creators, they omit because they don't think about that kind of stuff because they've got access to the original tools, obviously. Sit 6. So these are starting to look repetitive. Seven. So what's that one? It's 1 to 90. Then sit 8. That is seated neutral, whatever that is, so we'll see what that is. That's 1 to 90. Right, so let's just close that and that for now. No. Right, reopen. This just helps IMVU untwist itself, because sometimes when you're mucking around with the action stuff, it doesn't. Right, so that's good. So sit 1. Whoops. Why is it not sitting? Oh, that's funny. See, it's loaded in. And it shouldn't have done. And this is why when you're deriving your products, you generally don't want to be using the default defaults, because IMVU has a bad habit of loading them. That's standing. Why is it loaded the standing ones in? Has a bad habit of loading data back in, which we don't want. We want to remove these. Let's try that again. So sit1. Get rid of all this randomization stuff because I don't need it. Then we'll save the file and reopen it to see if it's kept it. Let's see if it's reloaded. Yep, it's brought it back in. That's annoying. So let's just do oops. Yeah, that's kind of frustrating. Right, so we've got 1. That's another. 6. Sit 7. Sit 8. So the alternative is knowing what the poses are individually. Let's see if I can go to sit 1. Nope. So maybe we have to add sit one, an extra avatar, same ensemble, sit one. So what it might be doing is defaulting to the four actions sitting. So that's action one, action 1, 2, 3. So maybe you'd have to create a whole set of actions. So 7, 8, 9, up to about 15, I guess it is, because IMVU must be, if it sees that there are actions available, it's going to load in the defaults over whatever settings, custom settings have been done for actions 1 through 6 or 1 through 5, because we've got 0. So if you do something with action 0, so we've got a trigger sit 1, but because that is action 0, when the file reloads, IMVU is just going to reload the defaults and override whatever is, because we haven't overridden that action or the way that the file is set up. So that's probably why it's doing what it's doing. So that would mean setting up one through 90, replace, just removing these triggers for, because it's defaulting, so it's defaulting to stance dot sitting and stance dot standing to activate, automatically activate. So sit 1, sit 2, and this was 1 to 90 as well. So if I do sit 1 now, so that's that pose, sit 1, sit 2, that's that pose, sit 3, hi doll, sit 3, so that was 1 to 2, so we do sit 3, so that's sit 3. So it's a bit messy, but this might be waves back at you, doll. It's a bit messy, but this might work. If it doesn't, what this does also then mean or allow is, with the poses isolated, it might then be possible to recreate them in Blender or 3D Studio Max, whatever application it is, so that, so let's take that pose for example. So we need a pose like that, because with the skirt, when the avatar goes into that pose, it clips at this section. So if we had, get rid of that one, nope. So if we had that pose readily available in Blender, so let's try this. Shouldn't really be doing this in this particular file, but we need an animation or a pose that we can test clothing deformation against. So based on the way that IMVU animates as pose their characters, you shouldn't be bending this bone to create this pose, because it keeps the hip bone static. The hip bones don't move, so they haven't used the hip bones to create their poses. So that, I mean, so, and this is why we need the wireframe. We need a wireframe view of what the avatar's bones are doing, because to get that pose, to get that leg cross, so that goes up, to get that, there's a couple of ways we can do it. We can either move the hip bone under and do that, which it looks like they may actually have done, or have they done this? Have they just rotated the thigh bone, which is why the mesh collapses as bad as it does in this section of the avatar? Because all that deformation of the mesh, all of it, is being done by the thigh bone, when there's, I mean, actually there's the pelvis bone, the hip bone and the thigh bone all control this section of the mesh. So let me just straighten that out. Whoops. So if we go into weight paint mode, so this upper section, so this is the problem area, this bit at the front, and it extends up basically to the belt as well, but for the most part it's this lower section. That is controlled by 3 bones: spine 01, pelvis, well 4 bones because the 2 hips, left, right, but and the hips. But the problem is, well, it's also controlled by the thigh bone, but not as much or as readily as the other bones, because those are more specifically in the area that's being deformed. So what IMVU are doing, it looks like, and this is why we could do with the skeletal overlay, it looks like what they're doing, oh, this is going to be tricky in weight paint mode, rotate the R key and then lock the axis with the X key, so we get that little line. So it looks like what IMVU have done, so that's the R key and Z, is that they've animated that pose, whoops, using just the thigh bones, which is, it's bonkers to do it that way. It's utterly bonkers. It's no wonder why clothing creators go mad. So there is the pose that there is potentially causing all the problems, because all that mesh deformation that we were just highlighting is focused on that area, but it's only controlled by, well, obviously left and right, but just one bone, when there are 2 or 3 others that could be used to spread the deformation of the mesh across. So if it was done using, let's see if we can do this. So if I'm sounding rather exasperated, it's because I am, because this just, it's utterly nonsensical, and it makes the problem much more difficult. You see, because now, because of the way that the avatar is structured, you can't use the hip bone on its own either. So you have to use a combination of bones to get this to distort properly. I say properly as in without too many issues. But if they haven't done it that way, then you're stuck. Because that's how I would create a pose. I would use the 2 bones, the hip bone. I would do most of the pelvis area rotation using the hip bone, and then most of the leg rotation. Yes, exactly. Pulling. It's no wonder why clothing creators literally are pulling their hair out, and they do all the stuff that they do. And this, of course, leads on to the problem of you know, those not the skin-colored suits, but the underlying mesh that creators use to hide problems like this. So this section, because of course we can't make the mesh match the deformation of the inside of a leg, because the mesh doesn't have an inside of a leg. So obviously meshes then create an inside submesh and allow that to be colored or tinted the same as the clothing item. And of course that leads to the problems of people then, when the item goes through peer review, thinking that you're trying to skirt the minimum coverage guide, which you're not. You're just trying to alleviate a problem that's caused because of this, because of the way that the avatar is animated or is posed. And of course it gets really bad when the avatar is, whoops, that's a bit too much, is yoinked up into these more extreme poses that deform the mesh much more aggressively. So if we, on the right hand side, so we're trying to replicate this. So I'm assuming that that pose is spread across the hip bone and the thigh bone. I'm assuming that. I don't know that that's how it's done, because I can't imagine that they would try and control that with just the one bone. But it looks like that is the case. See, so now, and that's why we can just start to see it here. We've got mesh clipping, because this is a rather extreme pose to put the character in. But the point of all of this is, where's the foot gone? So the point of doing this would be, right, so now we've also got the character leaning forward slightly. So again, is this done with spine 01? So is the spine doing that? Or is it the pelvis that's leaning forward and then they're compensating somehow? And that deforms the mesh even more. So again, we've got clipping. But if creators had access to these sorts of default poses for their clothing items, so it looks like that's going to be another project, is creating a set of poses that can be used to test clothing. Don't necessarily have to do anything with the arms, but oops. Let's just leave it like that for now. So, T-pose. No, that's not T-pose. So let me just mark that. So select all, location, rotation. And we'll call that, what was that? Sit 3. So, in theory, what this would then mean is that clothing creators, so let's create a new one. So this is T-pose, T.pose. So reset, select all, reset. Location, rotation. So you've made your clothing item, blah, 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 blah. You've done all your meshing, made sure it looks okay. You've even exported it and tested it, but what you can now do, or what we should then be able to do, is select the pose and go into that pose in our 3D tools, Max, Blender, whatever it is, doesn't really matter, and have access to the actual poses that the avatar is using in order to test the deformation of the mesh, because of course we don't have access to that from within IMVU, because it just automatically cycles through them. And that's what we're missing. So we need that kind of tool set, but because it doesn't exist, so someone has to create it. So I guess that's another project. So how many are there? There's 8. So it means sit 3. What do we do for sit 4? So that's another pose. So we can keep Now let's just go back to T-pose, create a new one. So this would be sit, was it sit 3? Sit 4. So sit 4. And this needs to be more relaxed, but it looks like the way that they've done this, they've actually tilted the pelvis bone. And kept the front relatively flat. Then brought the legs forward. Get your foot out of my face. Oops. Oh, and we can see just how easy poses could be well. So Doll's asking, so no matter if the mesh isn't posable, then it will tear or clip anyway. Well, the idea really is that what we need is access to the ability to be able to properly check. So when we derive our product, our clothing item, and we load it into create mode, we are trying to solve a problem after the fact, essentially. So we're trying to avoid clipping. So I don't know if I've still got some of the older ones. Yeah, so let me just load this. So it's the same items that the avatar is sitting on. So we have context. But as we can see, there's some clipping. So if we had access to the poses in the 3D app, we might be able to better mitigate the problems of clipping in the 3D app rather than trying to do it after the fact and having, and this is the bit that's the frustrating bit, because we can't isolate these individual poses in IMVU, we have to wait for the avatar to cycle through the poses or the animations, the actions that it's got associated with the avatar. We have to wait for it to cycle through all of them in order for it to get back to the one that shows the clipping. And, you know, based on the settings that IMVU oh, we can't do it for that one. Based on the settings that IMVU has, you know, so there are, it's cycling through essentially 8 or 9, I think it's 8. When we originally derived, there are 8. So it's cycling through 8 of these, 8 separate animation sequences, and it's doing it randomly. So, you know, if you've been making clothes and you get the clipping happening in a particular pose, you might have to wait 10 minutes for it to cycle through and account for all this random stuff, you might be waiting 10 minutes just to see the clipping again. So, you know, if you're doing that and getting clipping in 3 of the poses of the 7 or 8 that there are, you know, three waits of 10 minutes is 30 minutes. So you're waiting 30 minutes to try and solve a problem that, you know, should be relative. It should be easier to sort these sorts of things out. So if we have access to the pose in the actual 3D app, it might make all the difference, because it then means we're not having to wait inordinate amounts of time for the avatar to decide whether it wants to show us the clipping or not. But what I was going to say was, this is the clothing avatar. We can't use this for poses in IMVU. But if we could, we can see just how easy it is to create a pose by selecting what are essentially control bones that allow us to, whoops, that's a bug with Blender. It makes the avatar go a bit funny. We just select control bones and pose a skeleton, and quite quickly that would ordinarily mean being able to quickly create a pose and just like that be done. So we'll leave the hands because we don't need to focus on those. But because we can't use this particular skeleton for pose creation, it means we have to use the other one, which is a lot more frustrating to use because we have to select individual bones and pose them. But for the purposes of clothing testing, this would work. So location rotation. So we've got our clothing item sorted out. So we're in the T pose. That's what we would make the clothing item in. So we would have the avatar reset to the T pose. And then when come time to test it, we just select the different poses. So this is a bit rough and ready, but it might be a project that I'll have to add to the clothing file, starter file. Do it for both. Should be able to use this for both the male and the female characters. But this, in theory, should make clothing items much more, well, much less frustrating to make for starters. So let's have a look at one of the extreme poses that was causing one of the problems. Was it pose 3? Did we do that one? Yeah, so that was one of the poses that's causing an issue. Because, let me just hide the skeleton. We've got the mesh, it's essentially folding back on itself. So this, whoops, this edge here was the front of the skirt, which was, yes, so that's the, yes, so that's the front of, so what we've got, so this is the front of the skirt. So this edge has been rotated all the way up here. in order to accommodate the pose that we've got. So when you've got that kind of extreme mesh deformation from a pose, it's going to be difficult to mitigate that problem of clipping, because it means that the mesh is essentially folded in on itself. So just hide the top and the hands. So instead of a straight line, what we've now got is essentially something akin to that. Well, in fact, actually, probably more that. So all of this has become this, which is a massive amount of mesh distortion. So it becomes questionable, and we can see what's actually happening. That front edge, that front leading edge, has collapsed into the mesh. And when you've got that degree of mesh deformation, it's going to be really, really tricky to solve problems like this, where you get these small areas poking through because the mesh has deformed so much. And adding mesh structure, so we could add an edge loop that runs around the front of the mesh and around the back as well, but that wouldn't necessarily solve this problem. So it's not something that would necessarily be solved by adding more structure to the mesh. And this is why when we looked at this yesterday, we discovered that let's create a new one. Just need something black. Oh. Accessories. Oh, that'll do. Way. Sparkly pants. You can see that they've actually left out that section of the torso, and that's why they do it. It's because you don't then have to deal with, whoops, you don't then have to deal with clipping. But the downside of that, hi Kyle, yes, well, not necessarily tackling clipping, where we are discussing the frustrations of clipping and what we could possibly do to alleviate the problem. So it's, do you get rid of the section of the mesh and then limit the choices that derivers have for doing transparencies or whatever it is that they want to do to their meshes when they derive from them, you know, ripped jeans or whatever it is? Or do you leave that out, so it's just blank, so there's nothing there? Whoops. So its clothing is tricky. It's not a design problem. It's a well, it is a design problem to a degree, but the problem is exacerbated by the way that the avatar is animated or posed, and the way that that causes the mesh to collapse. So just for you, Kyle, we were just talking about recreating the static poses. So I've just gone through the derived from the default avatar 80 and just set up some actions that allow, well, not allow, that focus on specific poses, you know, because the default cycles through, where is it? The default cycles through about 8 different poses, and they're obviously difficult to work with when you're trying to do your clothing items. So what we've just done is isolated a couple of poses. So sit 4, sit 3. I've just done some rough recreations in Blender, and this would be applicable for Macs as well. We've just recreated the pose in Blender so that we can see approximately, obviously this isn't going to replicate because we don't know exactly what bones have been used to create the pose, but it gives us an approximate idea as to how the clothing mesh is going to deform, and all we need to do is switch between the poses. Oh, right. But so this is just a sort of a follow-on from the previous streams where we were talking about, what were we talking about? Weight painting. We're talking about a couple of other things, weight painting and just general clipping but in the interim, I was thinking about how to mitigate this problem of clipping. And of course, because we don't have access to the poses, the actual original pose data, it's difficult to test the clothing by loading it into IMVU. It would be much more effective if we had access to the poses in our 3D apps, Blender or 3D Studio Max, so that we could toggle through the poses to get a rough approximation of how the mesh is going to deform, and then obviously adjust accordingly. So T-pose, let's recreate this pose. Create a new pose. So this is, what was this? Sit 7. And again, we're going to assume that they've used the not the pelvis, the thigh bones as the bones controlling the main articulation. Whoops. Carl's just asking if we keep up with all the Blender versions. More or less, yes. I put it this way, when Blender is being installed, I install it from the zip file, not from the exe, because that overrides the default. Well, that overrides the previous version that was installed. So again, we're assuming that the thigh bones control this aspect of the legs, and it's not the hip bones. No worries. Thanks for dropping by, Doll. It's appreciated. Waves back at you. Okay, so that'll do for that. So that's another pose where we often get clipping, whoops, in that area. So again, location, rotation, so that's sit 7. Oh, forgot to do the... Whenever you create a pose, if you've got several of them, always remember to enable fake user, and that'll create a, well, literally what it is a fake user, and that keeps that data block in memory or within the file. So we've got 3 poses, well 4 actually, including the T-pose, so let's just fake user that as well. So we've got the T-pose, so that's what you would make your clothing item under. So you would be using the T-pose, you'd make your clothing item, whether it's a skirt, sock, shirt, doesn't matter. And then to test it, you'd have to select the armature, which is displayed. I've got this displayed as, yes, T-pose. It's, do you know why it's a T-pose? This is one of the things that people don't know. If you pose, if you create your character with its arms down by its side, what can often happen, whoops, is that the under the arms we don't put enough structure under the arms so that when the avatar stretches its arms above its head, it causes a lot of stretching under the arms. So you'd get a, well, I mean the avatars do this anyway, but you'd get this area basically stretching out And the T-pose is essentially an average between the two extremes by the side, or up above the head. So the T-pose allows for adding a little bit more structure under there that would accommodate both pose extremes and above on the shoulders as well. That's why we use a T-pose. It also makes it easier to make sleeves and things, because you can actually get in under there. So you'd make your clothing in the T-pose and then just switch to test how the mesh deforms. So I think that's going to be a project that I'll have to work on, and then provide that as an alternative clothing file for creators, for Blender users in particular, because it's the only way to solve problems of clipping. And then it gives you a better, oh, see, you've got some clip, is that, oh no, that's the old one. That's the new version. So we've got a bit of clipping still in place on that pose. And this is where it gets tricky, because that pose is essentially that pose, but as we can see from this, we don't have any clipping. So what is IMVU doing different? And this is why we need access to the skeleton. We need to be able to see a wireframe overlay so that we can see what bones are deforming and by how much. Oh, there we go. B bones, that's the one I was using. So that one's okay. So that's that pose. So that's sit 4. That's going to be sit 3. And then there are a couple of others. Let's get rid of that. So sit 1, sit 2, sit 3, sit 4, sit 5, that's not doing anything, sit 6, oh, did I set those up? Alright, so that's loaded in the defaults as well. That's re-established or re-linked up the original content. So you'd have to, so we're going to have to set up a whole set of extra pose actions that link to the actual animation sequences in order to keep them separate from the originals and the defaults, so that we can manually type and get the specific pose to play infinitely, which we can then match up in Blender. So yeah, that looks like it's a project for urgent consideration. Right, Well, we've been going for nearly an hour and a half, so we can call it quits there. So this whole clothing malarkey is a bit of a malarkey. And it's no wonder why a lot of creators end up putting it's no wonder why a lot of creators end up creating underlying meshes to try and hide some of the problems that crop up. But there's only so much you can hide based on the, because I'm not quite sure, but I'm guessing that IMVU didn't make any original content that involves skirts, because if they had, they would have seen these problems cropping up. So that was all rather exciting and frustrating and exacerbating. Yeah, I'll do that. I'll sort out some poses that can be used as a reference, because that is irksome. Might be too little too late, considering the fact that there are 50 million products in the catalogue almost, but you know, more the merrier. Right, so we'll call it quits there. And that hour and a half went fast, went by rather quickly. And all because I just wanted to make a simple skirt. That'll learn you. Right, okay, we'll call it quits there. Thanks for lurking lurkers, and thanks for chatting, Kyle Doll. Just scrolling up through the chat. Kyle Doll, subsigns or cities, and then for scope. And we shall see you on the next one, which might be taking a look at the new IMVU Studio tools. Take a break from making this from this skirt thing, and we'll take a look at the new IMVU Studio tools. So that'll be interesting. Cheers, Kyle. Same back at you. Right. We'll see you in the next. Oh yes, they've released Studio. It's in beta, so obviously it's all up in the air. But we might take a look at that in the next streams. Right, as they say somewhere, adieu.